to steal a kingdom. Legally-ish. Hi, I'm Veronica, the host, writer, and producer of Past, the podcast about those who would never rule. Today, I'm going to answer the question, how can you legally-ish steal a kingdom? The answer is, of course, to rewrite the law. Well, that and be a grown man and not a 4-year-old girl who happens to be an orphan. But how do you do that before you're actually king? Well, you could convince the leading men in the kingdom to follow your reinterpretation of a very old law. That could work, right? Well, it did. In November 1316. Wait, which kingdoms were stolen in 1316, you ask? France. Yeah, that rather large country in Europe. Its crown was usurped in that year, as was the nearby small kingdom of Navarre. I know, have you even heard of this? Okay, let's go back a little further to June 1316, almost 6 months earlier. The king, Louis X, who had earned himself the sobriquet, the Quarrelsome, or Le Houtin, sorry, my French is really bad, had just finished a game of real tennis on the 5th of June. This is the tennis played indoors on a large rectangular court. You have to hit bells and things like that. Having finished the game, he was a bit thirsty. He chugged a rather large serving of chilled wine, which led to his death, possibly from aspiration pneumonia, where you accidentally breathe in some of the liquid you're drinking, or pleurisy, an inflammation of the pleura, the tissue surrounding the lungs. Either way, not the nicest way to die. This was the first for France since 996. Not the king dying, that had happened 12 times. No. It was the first time a king hadn't had a male heir when he died. For more than 300 years, the crown of the Franks, and later the crown of France, had passed from father to his oldest surviving son. It's actually called the Capetian miracle. Louis had one child, a daughter, Jean, who was born to his first wife, Margaret of Burgundy. Now, Margaret of Burgundy and Louis's relationship was shocking. Here, let me give her a proper minute. Margaret was a granddaughter of St. Louis, just not the city, the real person, via her mother. Her husband, Louis, was the great-grandson of St. Louis. As I say in my podcast, everyone is related, papal dispensation was received. Margaret's father was the Duke of Burgundy. She had been married to Louis at the age of 15. Louis, who was 16, apparently had next to zero interest in his wife. He was busy playing real tennis and being quarrelsome. Now, this next bit is controversial, as in there are some modern scholars and some at the time who feel that this was a bit of a setup. So what happened next? Well, in January of 1312, Louis and Margaret had their first and only child, Joan. I said he had next to zero interest, not zero. France had never had a queen regnant, but Louis and Margaret were young, in their early 20s. They could have plenty more children. All was well until 1314. Louis X's sister, Isabella of France, the Queen of England, noticed a few particular things about Margaret and one of her other sisters-in-law, Blanche, who was married to their brother Charles. Isabella had given Margaret and Blanche and her third sister-in-law, Joan, who was Blanche's sister, hand-embroidered coin purses while visiting France. Months later, 2 French knights visiting the English court were seen wearing Margaret and Blanche's coin purses. Isabella informed her father, who was the king at the time, Philip IV, when she returned to France. Philip kept things quiet for the moment, but he knew he had to do something. The royal wives were watched in the following weeks until there was enough evidence to charge Margaret and Blanche with adultery. The 2 knights were also charged and under torture confessed to having affairs with Margaret and Blanche. The 2 women were tried by the Parlement of Paris. If you want more on this, there's an episode. I'll link to it. After being found guilty, they were imprisoned in Chateau Gaillard, a formerly English castle in Normandy. Margaret's story doesn't have a happy ending. She died either via strangulation or starved to death, likely on the orders of her husband, mainly so he could marry again. Blanche was eventually removed from prison and put into a convent. It helped that her sister Joan was around to support her. So what does any of this scandal have to do with the throne of France? Remember how Louis and Margaret had one daughter? Well, the knights claim that the affair with Margaret had started in 1311, and little Joan was born in early 1312. Yep, her legitimacy was questionable. Lucky for Joan, though, her father Louis claimed her. Apparently she was his child, in his eyes at least. So it's now 1315. Louis X is king. His supposedly adulterous wife is dead. It's time to get married. He's young, 25 at the most, and he had plenty of time to have more children. Young Joan probably won't even matter in the long run. He marries Clementa of Hungary, who's approximately 22 or 23 and apparently very pretty. Everything is going well. Yay! But you'll remember from about 5 minutes ago, Louis X doesn't have long to live, right? When he died, Clementa was pregnant. If she had a son, everything would be fine, right? Close. She did have a son, John, born on the 15th of November, 1316. Sadly for little John, he was born in 1316, which wasn't a great time to be an infant. Mortality rates ranged from 30 to 50%. For reference, infant mortality ranges within the OECD range from less than 0.2% in Iceland to a little over 1.3% in Mexico today. John died at only 5 days old, and this left France and Navarre in a bind, though let's focus on France. Little Joan was not even 5 and an orphan, plus France had never had a queen. What happened? Well, Joan's uncle Philip decided he really wanted to be king. I mean, Philip thought him being king would be the best thing for France, stability and all. But you just can't take a throne, right? Really, is he going to have to kill his niece to become king? Well, no, thankfully. Philip decided to use legal means, or he made up legal means. Use a brand new interpretation of a rather ancient law, Salic law. He decided that he should be king. This interpretation of Salic law was that women couldn't inherit the throne and couldn't pass on their inheritance to a son. I'll explain this further before I go for the day. And that, along with the agreement of his nobility, which his uncles, Charles of Valois and Louis of Evreux, and even Joan's maternal uncle, Odo, went along with. Odo was bribed a little with Philip's daughter as his new bride. Yeah. So they made Philip king as Philip V. That is how you, legally-ish, steal a kingdom. Now, Navarre was also taken by Philip. It had been inherited from his mother, Joan I, and the Navarrese nobility were happy for him to be their king. In the end, Philip didn't have a surviving son, so France and Navarre were passed to his younger brother, Charles, as Charles IV of France. Oddly, this Charles, not their Uncle Charles, didn't originally support his brother's usurpation. Charles wouldn't have a surviving son, so upon his death, France went to his cousin, Philip, as Philip VI, the first Valois king of France. But Navarre was not okay with this. Philip of Valois was not Navarrese, so Joan was suddenly very important again. She was crowned as Joan II of Navarre. Now, I discussed Joan's story in detail in her episode of my mini-series, The Capetian Miracle Ends. I also discuss Philip of Valois' father, Charles of Valois, in 3 episodes from my mini-series, Father Time's Mismanagement. You can find those on my podcast. Download link is in the description box or here on YouTube. I also discuss Salic law in a lot of detail since I find it fascinating. I think it's unfair for people to claim that Philip V used Salic law to make his claim. He used Salic law to justify something he was already going to do. He used his support in court to make his claim to the throne. So what does Salic law say? I know it's a bit of work to find this if you want to know. There is a link in the description box, but I'll read the part of the law that was used. Section 59, Part 6. But of Salic land, no portion of the inheritance shall come to a woman, but the whole inheritance of the land shall come to the male sex. Yep, that's it. Nothing about royalty or a kingdom. Just Salic land goes to men. What is Salic land? Good question. Salic land, or terra salica, is land given in exchange for military service, which is why it makes sense that Salic land can only go to men, because only men can meet the military requirement. I didn't make the rules back then. But it has nothing to do with royal claims, because the royal is granting the land. While Philip V only lightly pointed towards Salic law, the Valois kings of France would use it to prop up their claims and point to it regularly. If you want more on this story and what happened next, please come listen to my podcast. In addition to just Joan's story, I also covered a great deal of the 100 Years' War, the war that was caused by this decision, and I hope you'll join me there. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all in about a month. Bye!